Dear participants, I think we start slowly but surely. This is our third webinar by the executive of bpw International. I have the great pleasure to welcome Jenny Gulamani-Abdulla, our executive secretary. Jenny is a member of the International Bar Association with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Canada and a doctorate in law from the United States. She is also a regular Canadian immigration consultant with over 27 years of experience as CEO and founder of Gulamani-Abdulla and Company Immigration Consulting. She responds to diverse clientele from around the world. Jenny is the co-founder of the Canadian Federation for Citizenship, a not-for-profit organization engaging citizens of Canada to develop homegrown leadership through active citizenship. She's recognized in the Expert Women database of informed opinions in Canada, which aims to amplify women's voices for a more democratic Canada. Jenny was titled one of Canada's most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network and was recipient of the prestigious Women Economic Forum Award, iconic Women Creating a Better World for All. She was awarded the 2012 Distinguished Alumna Award at the University of Calgary. Jenny has served on numerous boards, including co-chair of the Professional Services Division at the United Way of Calgary and the area, and occupied a seat on the advisory council of the Quest for Best Campaign and the 1,000 Women Rising initiative at Bow Valley Village. Bow Valley College, sorry. I'm very, very happy to greet her today. Dr. Jenny Gulamani-Abdulla is our distinguished executive secretary, and she will give us insights on how BPW International works and on what basis we are relaying. So welcome to you and thank you very much. I just want to give you some housekeeping information. We will record the presentation of Dr. Jenny, and then the questions, please ask them in the chat, and she will respond to questions, but the recording will be stopped after the presentation. And you are not being seen. It's a webinar that will be afterwards on our website as a webinar on our YouTube channel, and you can have access to it and listen to it whenever you feel like it. Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours, Dr. Jenny. Thank you very much for coming.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you, President Catherine, for this opportunity and this invitation to address BPW members worldwide to honor our new triennium theme of new actions through cooperation by creating and perhaps elevating our understanding of BPW International's constitution. Now, I really appreciate members who have taken the time to join us live, as it takes prioritizing our lives depending on where you live, so that you can not only attend the formal part of this presentation, but what follows and may not necessarily be recorded, but is part of the discussion and allows us to perhaps exchange comments and concerns and questions that members, have. And of course, this is where executive members are looking for input, and we're able to then take away from your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. I also want to acknowledge those who will watch the formal presentation in the near future And also, we'll have ideas and questions. So I would like to invite all thoughts and questions. I would like to hear from you even after you have viewed this presentation or this webinar, maybe at your own convenience. So that, together I think we can improve our governance documents for the benefit and interest of BPW International. So at this point, what I will do is pull up my screen, and I will share the PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared. And it will allow us to, or it will allow me to kind of guide the discussion or the formal part of the presentation, and then be able to entertain some of the question and comments that you may have at your end at the end of this presentation. And I don't want to be too bogged down into the perhaps the legalized jargon of this, but also be able to present in a manner where all of our diverse members from various occupations are also able to understand and follow and be part of the solution at the end of the day. So as part of the agenda, what I would like to, from my end, during the formal part of this presentation, cover on some of these items. Looking at what is a constitution? I mean, generally speaking, what is a constitution and what does the Constitution cover? Why do we look at amendments, and why do we amend the Constitution? And perhaps then, when we have this general understanding, perhaps focus on BPW International's Constitution specifically, and then kind of coming out of the Constitution a little bit into our other governance documents, such as perhaps the regulations or the procedure manual, looking at the role of the executive secretary as to why it is that I'm presenting today, as part of my role and responsibility as executive secretary of BPW International, and perhaps look at some case scenarios, not getting into very specific, especially with case scenarios that are active, perhaps, but looking at case scenarios generally, and perhaps, honing in on areas that may have disputes or repeated disputes, and how perhaps we could resolve these by understanding the Constitution a little better. And then, of course, the discussion and questions, which is my favorite part. So, looking at at any constitution, right? Even looking at your own affiliate federations or affiliate club constitutions or others, we know that a constitution is basically a set of principles. And these principles, they outline the purpose for which we have come together, structure so that we know the parameters within which we work in, and then perhaps set limits of an organization. Now, a constitution is not necessarily supposed to be very restrictive, rather it's supposed to be permissive. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. What a constitution does overall is to provide this foundation on which any organization can operate on. So what it does, even for BPW International, our constitution is the bedrock. It is, the foundational piece, and it needs to be strong, it needs to be consistent, and it needs to operate with the interest and purpose of the organization, and the way that we operate within our organization. And so you start to see when you look through the Constitution, and many of us, will go back and look at the formal document and say to ourselves, I really want to spend some time reading it. And we can all, read it at our own time. But what the Constitution does have, and what I would like to draw your attention to, is that it consists of all of these major agreements that were made by the members on how the organization will function. And in law, many of us refer to it as the founding document of an organization. And to be honest, it is legally binding on the executive as well as the members of the organization. Now, I would say, the Constitution covers many things, and we will, spend time looking at it closely, even after this presentation. But what does the Constitution cover? And right away, you see at the very beginning or at the outset that it provides some reasons as to why this organization exists. It outlines the purpose and the objectives, and in our Constitution, they're referred to as aims of the organization. So this is where the organization lays out what it intends to achieve. And what it does is it describes who the individuals are that benefit from this work of the organization. And in our case, it's the members. And it sort of also refers to how they're going to benefit. Some of it requires a bit of, interpretation, but we will go through it in the following slides. What the Constitution does is it specifies how one can become a member. Of course, all members have their rights and their duties, and with rights and duties come a certain set of responsibilities. But what the Constitution also covers is how members can resign or be expelled. Now, looking closely at the Constitution, and in your first reading or perhaps multiple readings, you're going to see that it defines how the organization will operate and how it's going to carry out its work. It also states very clearly the organization's principles, and these are general principles, broad stroked, and obviously the structures so that we know how decisions are made and how our work will actually get done. So at the end of the day, these principles and the structures are what we really need to pay attention to so that we could align ourselves, be consistent, even with our, international constitution, allowing that to be consistent with our federation clubs, constitutions, our affiliate clubs, even individual members, and how certain principles and certain basic structures need to stay consistent. The Constitution also explains how and when the finances and the assets of the organization will be dealt with. And I'll bring your attention to one specific line, when it comes to finances, because that is where we establish the fiscal year. So the Constitution actually lays out that fiscal year. Now let's move on to amending the Constitution, and we all know this, but let's reiterate it for perhaps our new members, our young BPW members, that constitutions are really long-term decisions. I mentioned that they are the founding document, so thought has been put into this in order to come up with this governance document. So the constitutions are, generally speaking, with very long-term thinking, long-term decisions that are intended to last throughout the life of the organization. And when we make changes, changes also involve major decisions. And so these changes, many of us know, are referred to as amendments. Now, amendments are viewed as improvements, ways to make things better, because these adjustments are made to that original founding document. So, to begin with, this document is, the bedrock. And then when we make these improvements, and we hope that the amendments are being made to improve, so that, the organization is constantly moving forward. Now, the existing constitution actually outlines when and how these amendments can be made. So when we're thinking of amendments, or when we're thinking of making changes to the Constitution, we actually need to understand what the existing Constitution says about amendments, so that we are consistent with what it is that we're doing. Because eventually everything goes back to the founding document, and then perhaps the context is laid around that founding document, with, of course, the intention to improve. And amendments are proposed when new agreements about some of these basic principles of the organizations are made. So you'll remember in the previous slides when I said, we have our principles and our structures. Well, now we're looking at agreements that have been made. And these are not agreements just with one another as members. These are agreements that we have made with the organization. Just like in a country's constitution, a country's constitution is really an agreement between the country and its citizens. So let's view also the BPW International as it's not an agreement between you and I, or us as members, or between the executive and the members. It's actually a relationship between BPW International as an organization and its members. Now, its members are quite diverse, so we may, all have very diverse ways of thinking, and we come from diverse occupations, from diverse experiences, so our diverse thought can actually be used as a strength to solidify our relationship with the organization, BPW International. Amending the Constitution also requires certain processes and procedures. And, when we amend, of course, we need to make sure that timings are also, abided by, so that members are educated on these amendments, they understand these amendments, and then, of course, they can vote on these amendments. So amendments are always circulated to the members. And then once they are passed, the appropriate bodies that the organization is registered with is then notified of these changes. And in fact, that is a mandatory process that needs to be followed where registration is concerned with the registry, so that these amendments that have been approved by the members, by the voters, that the appropriate registry is notified of these amendments. So let's now move into BPW International's constitution specifically. And here I would say that it is extremely important to understand how short this document is, right? It's, if you look at it, it is a 2-page, I would say, governance document that we consider to be foundational. In fact, I would say it's a page and a half, because the other half page, I think, is basically just looking at some definitions, defining some terminology, perhaps things like what a Congress is, etc. So there are 4 or so definitions that follow the BPW International Constitution. Here I say that it's a 2-page governance document, which includes those definitions, the terminology piece. And these 2 pages, just imagine, are considered to be what is foundational. Now, of course, the Constitution is followed also by the regulations. So the next 13 or so pages that you look at, remember, that's not the Constitution, it's actually the regulations. So after the page and a half, you have the definitions, then it's followed by the regulations. And remember, we're also supporting these governance documents through a procedure manual, which is, by the way, 50 plus pages. I believe it's 53. So let us remember that the Constitution itself, again, a 2-page, I would say 1.5. And then, in order to properly be able to implement, we need to understand the regulations. And then, of course, make sure that we understand the procedure manual, which is then supporting the regulations. The Constitution, I think, I mentioned this earlier about a relationship. And basically what it does, it's a connection point. It's a connection point between the organization and its members. And it's based on these key guiding principles that we've talked about that are, supported by the basic structures as well. And when you look at the page and a half, it's quite interesting because you'll see these 8 particular areas that the Constitution covers. Now, when you look at the title, it's pretty straightforward. You see, International Federation of Business and Professional Women, which is also referred to as BPW International, and you see our registered address. And so, and Switzerland in this case. And so when you look at the second section, which then talks about the type of organization, and I'll get into this particular, section later in the case scenarios, because, there is one that really covers this well, because at the end of the day, remember, if we're nonpartisan meaning independent of government and private sectors, well, nonpartisan means that our actions have to match our words. When we say nonpartisan on paper in black and white, are we then acting in a way, and are our initiatives showing that we're nonpartisan? Same thing with, the word nonprofit. Nonprofit, well, not for profit, or not for profit for whom? For the organization. How are members benefiting from this? How is the organization benefiting from this? Again, we've got to look at our words, what we put down on black and white, and then ensure that our actions follow that, or our implementation of projects actually demonstrate that we are nonpartisan, nonprofit, and our Constitution goes as far as saying that it is actually, voluntary. The membership is voluntary. Our involvement is voluntary. So I'll go through this in one of the case scenarios. Moving on to the third, which is the aims of the organization. And I talked about, the purpose or the objective is where this lies. And you see right away the one-liner talking about uniting. And this is quite powerful because it's about everybody coming together. Diverse in thought, diverse in occupations, diverse in age, diverse in all sorts of different ways. And, this is where the aims then become very detailed, talking about these 4 areas of focus. And this is where you start to see our cornerstones and our values, and you see the areas like economic empowerment and others. So you start to see exactly what we are all about. But the very first line, to unite, right? So this is where The challenge is in every part of the world, in every region, in every local, national, global, organization, you see that diversity may have its challenges along with its benefits. When you look at the structure, when and especially looking at the Constitution, of course, the structure is very detailed when you get into the regulations and the procedure manual, because it will actually break everything up into, individual positions and that type of thing. But here, for the purpose of understanding the Constitution, we've got to remember that the structure piece in the Constitution, C4, actually situates BPW International, and it situates the Congress. And so it's really important. I think this is the place where you need to go to understand structure. When we get closer to the Congress, I think this is a place where we could really spend some time on where the Constitution is concerned. And of course, it gets very time consuming when you start looking at our regulations and procedure manual where structure is concerned. I would look at C5, and this is part of the Constitution out of the 8 parts that it discusses. And this is where affiliates are mentioned. And you'll notice that either it refers to federations, it talks about federation clubs, it talks about affiliate clubs, and it talks about individual affiliates. And so this is how it starts to show how our membership is classified and categorized. And so based on, the number of members, depending on, what you're looking at and from your region, this is where you can actually start to look at, the Constitution, to look at the different categories. And some of you also carry this through to your national Constitution, and perhaps even your local bylaws and constitutions, where you're talking about how you're going to categorize your membership. And of course, the whole idea is to align yourself. And if you're aligning yourself with the Constitution, you will see that the international Constitution is so broad and general that it's very easy to align yourselves locally, provincially, state-wise, and nationally, to be able to align yourself with the international Constitution, because it is quite permissive, and it's quite broad, and it's not intended to restrict other constitutions in any way, shape, or form. Looking at the 6th part here in the Constitution is truly about the fiscal year. And many of us know that it runs like the yearly calendar, so January 1st to December 31st. And we understand that for certain practical purposes, depending on where you live and where you're geographically located, and perhaps, whether you have charitable status or not, and whether you need to meet your national tax guidelines or tax reporting and filing guidelines, those things might change from region to region, maybe country to country. And so, for international's purpose, for BPW International's Constitution lays out the fiscal year to be January 1st to December 31st. Then looking at almost to the end, C7 talks about dissolution. This is how we talk about, well, if we were to fold, if, we talk about this even at the local and national levels, where we say, just before we wind down or close a club or amalgamate, 2 or 3 clubs together, and however we dissolve, we have, a set of guidelines as to how that can happen. And we should know that at the international level, the Constitution focuses on the fact that dissolution or dissolving BPW International would only happen at a General Assembly. and for obvious reasons. I mean, that is the highest governing body. This is where most decisions take place internationally. And so you will see that C7 dissolution section actually brings it down to a timing, and that's at a General Assembly. We also look at this last section, and we've talked about this with the amendments. And so again, this also situates amendments to take place at General Assembly. So let me, for a moment, maybe talk about something outside of the Constitution, because, the Constitution does not necessarily outline everyone's role or responsibility, but taking this outside of the Constitution for just, the next couple of slides, perhaps, is to talk about the role of the Executive Secretary on matters involving the Constitution. Because our at the local or national levels, executive secretaries normally have administrative type or operational type of roles. But because BPW International has its own president's office, its own communications team through the webmaster, the the operational, the admin issues are looked at a very different level and a very formal way, perhaps also to ensure that handover, transition, etc., are done, in a manner that are very professional, very consistent, and done through staff, etc., to ensure that the succession is done in the most professional way. So looking at the executive secretary's role on matters involving the Constitution, I see these three as being directly linked to the Constitution. And the first one is to actually advise on constitutional and procedural matters with reference, as and when necessary, to the Constitutional Advisory Committee. And so this Constitutional Advisory Committee is a group of individuals from around the world that hear about some of the resolutions that need to occur, and perhaps disputes that need to be resolved. And so it is quite a necessary, and I believe a very beneficial committee. So President Catherine Bosshart and myself are ex officio members on this Constitutional Advisory Committee. What the role of the secretary involves also is to support affiliation procedures when it comes to constitutions and regulations when new affiliates are formed also. So every time a federation club or an affiliate club is announced, it's a source of pride, because although VP membership, Juicy usually is the one to receive and do all the necessary work. At the end of the day, I get to review the constitution and regulations of the new affiliates, and also think of some of the ways, depending on where these affiliates or affiliate clubs or federation clubs are being formed, and thinking about perhaps even their country context, and the issue of remaining consistent with BPW International. Now, there are other contributions from my end, that perhaps involve some of the constitution type of focus, and we've started this with the regular communication to members. So you will notice on the communication that you receive from BPW International through the newsletter that we've started to have this constitutional corner, which is where we can start to give not the whole not to give you just whole bunch of legal jargon and repeat what's in the Constitution, but kind of contextualize for you where the work may be happening, or what may be relevant, or what we are working on as an executive board or as an international board, so that you're able to see some of the sections that become applicable based on what we're working on at that moment. So in February, you'll see that the standing committees, we talked a little bit about that, the role and the importance of these standing committees. And that was around the time when the standing committees actually were established and were starting out their important work. In March, you'll notice that we highlighted specifically with respect to affiliate federations and the numbers of members, because during the pandemic, perhaps your club or your locally and nationally, you will have seen perhaps numbers go up or numbers go down depending on where you're at and how the pandemic has affected you. And so in that situation in March, we did come out with what the Constitution says, and perhaps giving you some context on where we're at. Now, this might be a good place to perhaps, start ending with case scenarios. And of course, I want to make sure that we also leave some time for discussions and some of your questions and some of your thoughts, but also to go back to that aim. And I mentioned when we were talking about the 8 parts of the Constitution, and mentioning that one of them, very important, is the aim to unite. And of course, that's what all of us want to see, want to experience, and want to go through, whether we are at the executive level, or local, national, international, wherever we are, whether we're at the executive level, we want to make sure that we are uniting with each other at the executive level to get the work done for BPW International, but also, to now go through those cornerstones where the aims are listed, where we're talking about uniting, and then bringing those words that are in black and white into action. Because we all know that if we exhibit and showcase at the executive level, at the highest of leadership levels, we know that sentiment, that feeling will translate to our committees, to our chairpersons, to our membership, to those that actually do work on the ground. And the aim to unite is what we see among our citizenry, where we are at the grassroots level, where we are actually seeing our projects come to life. We see that this is much needed at every level, in every country across the world, whether you're focused locally, nationally, or internationally. We know that this sentiment of aiming to unite can then finally put to good use and benefit the actual working woman. So the case scenarios that I've chosen to kind of go through are based on what some of the cases that we might see. So, the first one, aiming to unite, we see that some of our disputes can actually be resolved when all parties come to the table, and then all parties understand one another, and unity can only come out of understanding one another. So, and it's always easier to talk, I mean, especially in this type of a webinar setting where, we're talking about one person talking and the rest listening. We all love to talk, but it's really important to also listen. And we all know this. Sometimes we learn more by listening, and we impart less by talking. um, this second case scenario, again, looking at that importance of remaining nonpartisan, living up to that whole ideal of BPW International being nonpartisan, nonprofit, and voluntary. And so some of the case scenarios that we, or some of the cases that we do encounter, even at the Constitutional Advisory Committee level, are these types of situations that then indicate to us that we need to look closer at perhaps our procedures. Because at the end of the day, our procedures are supposed to be democratic. Our procedures are supposed to be transparent, and they're supposed to be inclusive of all members. Now, why do we have to live up to this? Because our Constitution says so, right? Our Constitution says we need to, a whole section has been devoted to this area of remaining nonpartisan, nonprofit, and voluntary. And it starts off with ensuring that what's on black and white, what we're saying and what we're doing, how we're acting, are actually aligning and consistent. So, topmost, being democratic, being transparent, and including all of our members. I know it gets tough when we actually put it into action, but we can all strive to that aim. Decision-making bodies are accountable to members. And this is where, when we talk about democracy and then we talk about transparency, we talk about inclusion. Well, when we make decisions, we are also accountable to our members. So when decisions are made, we need to make decisions firmly, yes, but also consistently and in line with all of our governance documents, which is how we are going to be able to resolve disputes when we're able to show that this decision was made for the benefit of the members, to be accountable to the members, and for members to know that we are making decisions and we know that we are accountable to them. Now, the third one are definitely, this is something that is occurring everywhere as well, right? Because whenever you're collecting membership fees and whenever members believe that they are, they are actually, paying to the organization, they want to know they're paying for the reasons that they have signed up for. And then they want to make sure that not just, being transparent and being accountable, but also they want to ensure at the end of the day that those funds are being carefully managed. We do that with our own personal finances. We do that professionally at work. We make sure as business and professional women that we are carefully managing funds with the highest of integrity and honesty. And of course, these funds need to be used for the benefit of the organization, to promote and to achieve the aims of the organization. And the disputes that we see sometimes, and the disputes that you possibly see at your local and national levels, and eventually resolve them on your own, perhaps even without the involvement of BPW International. You know this because you're probably going through it, you're resolving it, and you're moving on. You're moving on with these things. So I noticed that the sun is coming up at my end. It's very bright and early in the morning. And again, I will move on to this very last case scenario. And this one is about removal of an affiliate. Now, the Constitution states that the International Board may remove an affiliate. Now, it's a one-liner, right? It's a one-liner where the Constitution states that the International Board may remove an affiliate. But we need to understand that the Constitution is followed by regulations and, of course, supported by the procedure manual. So here is an example of how these things come together. The way these things come together is that even though the Constitution says that the International Board may remove an affiliate, the regulations now break it down and bring it to a more specific situation. And it says It refers to unpaid dues and the fact that a federation, or an affiliate club has not communicated for more than 1 year. And then it also refers to damage to reputation, reputation of the organization, reputation of the organization locally, nationally, internationally, because remember, we need to be consistent. What is being talked about in terms of damaging reputation, I mean, that reflects whether it's happening locally or nationally, that reflects also on BPW International. So the Constitution gives you the one liner: the International Board may remove an affiliate, but then the regulations talk about, well, you can remove an affiliate if we're talking about unpaid dues and no one's communicating and it's been more than 1 year, and it's relating to uh, the risk to the organization in terms of its reputation. When you look at the procedure manual on the same issue, the procedure manual now gives you how this is going to be put into action, or how is it going to be implemented. So it gives you further guidance and further information as to how this is going to happen. So for example, the procedure manual then talks about a 3 months notice. So, you can't just go and remove an affiliate. You've got to give them 3 months notice. They have a right to reply. They have a right to appeal within 3 months of removal. So this is an example of how the Constitution, the regulations, and the procedure manual work together to then allow for certain actions to be taken and for all parties to have enough time, for all parties to come to this place of resolving that dispute. And so you can see that the three are tied together and used together to implement. I'll end with this. And, this is where we can say to ourselves that the International Federation of Business and Professional Women, BPW International, prides itself on the global resources that its members showcase on the world stage. And I want you to walk away with this, that we are making a difference no matter which part of the world we come from. And so this is where I stop, and where you can perhaps, start to engage with perhaps some comments or questions. And even if you are watching this webinar later on at your convenience, that you could always reach out to BPW International. Our email addresses are on the website, and you can always, reach out to us with your comments and how we could improve things at BPW International, but also to focus on how we can improve our organizations, because we are a leadership that changes every 3 years. So keep in mind that long-term view of improving things for BPW International. So I will stop here, and President Catherine Bossart, Dr. Bossart, we're back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jenny. I am very glad. I think you broke down the Constitution to the very crucial points. And what really strikes me, and I think what is incredibly important, is not only to talk but to listen. That is really an important issue, and we should not forget it. I think it's very, very crucial for all of us.